Some people say that luck only visits those who are ready to see it. But on a cold morning outside Dayton, Ohio, luck looked more like a rusted storage locker no one else wanted. The wind moved slowly through the rows of metal doors, carrying the dry smell of dust, cardboard, and old wood. It was the kind of place most people passed without noticing, a fenced lot filled with forgotten things and quiet echoes of other lives. Caleb Mercer stood near the back of a small crowd, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a worn canvas jacket that had seen too many winters. At 40 years old, Caleb had the broad shoulders and steady posture of a man who had spent years carrying tools and responsibility. But the lines around his eyes told another story, one of long roads, quiet nights, and plans that never quite worked out. Beside him sat Scout, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose thick gray and cream coat caught the pale morning light like frost on steel. The dog watched everything with calm amber eyes, ears lifting and tilting with each new sound, as if the world itself were a puzzle waiting to be solved. The auctioneer rattled a set of keys and cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the crisp air as he stepped toward the next locker in the row. Unit 47, he called, pulling the metal door upward with a loud scrape that echoed across the gravel lot. The door rolled open to reveal what looked like nothing more than years of discarded clutter. A broken lamp leaned against a stack of plastic bins. A wooden chair with one leg missing rested crookedly beside an old tool chest. Boxes of yellowed newspapers sagged under their own weight. Someone near the front chuckled softly. "Looks like a junk museum," another voice muttered. Caleb said nothing. He had been to enough auctions to know that most lockers were exactly what they appeared to be, piles of forgotten things waiting for one last chance before the landfill. Still, something about this one made Scout rise slowly to his feet. The dog stepped forward, nose lifting into the air, drawing in the scent of wood, rust, and something deeper beneath it all. Caleb felt the gentle tug of the leash and glanced down. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though Scout wasn't. Nervous. If anything, the shepherd looked focused. The auctioneer began the bidding low, barely expecting interest. $20. "Do I hear 20? A few people shook their heads and stepped back. One man shrugged and offered 15 just to keep the rhythm going, but his voice lacked conviction. Caleb glanced into his pocket, feeling the folded bills he had counted twice before leaving the truck that morning. $28. That was everything he had until the next odd repair job came along. Normally, he would have walked away without a second thought. But Scout gave a low, curious huff and stared directly into the shadowed back corner of the locker. The dog's ears stiffened. His tail lifted slightly, not in excitement, but in recognition. Caleb had seen that look before during the years they worked together overseas, when Scout had sensed something no one else could hear. The auctioneer lifted his clipboard again. 15 going once. The wind rattled a loose sign against the fence. Scout took one slow step forward and let out 3 short barks, sharp and deliberate. The sound turned a few heads in the crowd. Caleb exhaled quietly, then raised his hand. 20, he said. The auctioneer pointed without hesitation. 20 I have. Anyone want 25? No one moved. The crowd looked again at the dusty boxes, the broken chair, the piles of forgotten junk that smelled like damp cardboard in time. The silence stretched for a few seconds before the gavel tapped against the clipboard. Sold. Locker 47. Caleb nodded once and walked toward the open unit, while Scout trotted beside him, the dog's eyes still fixed on that same dark corner, as if something behind the wall had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally open the door. The crowd drifted away within minutes after the auction ended, tires crunching over the gravel as pickup trucks rolled out through the chain-link gate, and the cold air settled back into its quiet rhythm. Caleb Mercer remained standing in front of locker 47 with the small ring of keys now resting in his palm. The metal felt colder than he expected, as though it had been waiting a long time for someone to claim it. Scout moved ahead of him without hesitation, stepping carefully across the threshold into the dim storage unit. Dust floated in thin silver threads. Through the morning light that slipped beneath the raised metal door, and the faint scent of old wood and cardboard filled the narrow space. Caleb took a slow breath and followed the dog inside. Up close, the clutter looked even older than it had from the outside. A stack of plastic bins leaned against the wall with faded labels that had long since peeled away. A cracked suitcase rested beneath a wooden table whose legs wobbled unevenly on the concrete floor. Somewhere deeper in the unit, an old radio gave off a faint metallic smell, as if it had once carried music across decades before being forgotten. Caleb set his canvas bag down near the entrance and rubbed a gloved hand across his beard while he studied the room. $20 had bought him what most people would call nothing more than a pile of trouble. Still, trouble was something he understood. The quiet work of sorting and repairing things had carried him through many long weeks since leaving the army. If there was even one tool or piece of equipment inside worth fixing, the locker might pay for itself. Scout circled slowly along the left wall, nose close to the floor as he followed a trail only he could detect. His tail moved in a steady rhythm that Caleb recognized from years of watching the dog work. It was not excitement. It was concentration. The shepherd paused beside the broken chair and sniffed at the air before moving deeper into the shadows near the back of the unit. Caleb knelt beside the plastic bins and lifted the lid from the top one. Inside were bundles of old magazines tied together with yellow string, their pages curled and brittle with age. Beneath them, he found a small brass compass that still turned smoothly when he tilted it toward the light. He slipped it into his jacket pocket with a quiet smile. Even small things could find a second life in the right hands. Behind him, Scout let out a soft huff and began pawing gently at the concrete floor near the rear wall. Caleb looked over his shoulder. The dog was standing rigid now, ears high, nose pressed close to the base of the wall, as if listening to something beyond it. Caleb stood and brushed the dust from his knees. The back wall appeared no different from the rest of the unit at first glance. It was covered with rough wooden panels that had darkened with age, their surfaces scratched by years of shifting boxes and forgotten furniture. Yet as he stepped closer, he noticed something subtle that made him pause. One of the panels carried a faint seam along its edge where the grain of the wood did not quite match the boards beside it. Scout tapped the spot twice with his paw and glanced up as though asking a quiet question. Caleb ran his hand slowly across the surface of the panel. The wood felt slightly hollow beneath his knuckles when he tapped it. A soft echo returned from the other side, different from the solid thud of the surrounding boards. He leaned closer, studying the narrow line where the panel met the wall. Someone had once driven small screws into the corners, then covered them carefully with a thin layer of putty that had dried and cracked over time. Caleb felt a slow ripple of curiosity move through his chest. Storage lockers were meant to hold what people left behind, not hide what someone wanted to keep secret. Scout stepped back and sat down, watching with the calm patience of a partner who already knew the next step. Caleb pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and carefully scraped the dried putty from one of the hidden screws. The metal head emerged slowly from the dust, as if revealing itself after years of silence. He loosened it with a gentle turn, and then another. A second screw followed, then a third. With each quiet movement, the faint hollow sound behind the panel seemed to grow more real. When the final screw came free, Caleb placed his palm against the wood and pushed lightly. The panel shifted inward just enough to release a breath of cool air from the darkness behind it. Scout rose to his feet immediately, his ears lifting again as that same focused look returned to his eyes. Caleb stood there for a moment, staring into the narrow opening that had not seen daylight for years, sensing that whatever waited beyond the hidden wall had been resting in silence far longer than anyone at the auction had imagined. Caleb Mercer did not move for several seconds after the panel shifted inward. The narrow gap revealed nothing but darkness at first, a quiet pocket of space, sealed away behind the wooden wall for longer than anyone could easily guess. A thin breath of cool air slipped out through the opening, carrying a faint scent of old paper and metal that had rested untouched for decades. Scout stepped forward immediately, nose lifting as he drew in the unfamiliar smell with careful attention. The German shepherd did not bark this time. Instead, he gave a slow, thoughtful exhale, the kind he made when he had already decided something important was nearby. Caleb crouched beside the opening and gently pulled the panel wider until it rested against the side of the locker. The beam of daylight from the storage door stretched deeper now, revealing a narrow hidden cavity roughly 4 feet wide and perhaps 6 feet deep behind the wall. Someone had built the space deliberately. The interior was lined with simple plywood shelves, each one coated with a thin layer of gray dust that sparkled faintly when the light reached it. Scout stepped carefully into the hidden compartment, placing each paw with quiet precision as he inspected the shelves one by one. Caleb followed slowly, careful not to disturb anything before he understood what he was looking at. On the lowest shelf rested a small wooden crate bound with metal corners. Its lid had been fastened shut with two old brass latches that had turned a deep green with age. Beside it sat a narrow leather portfolio whose surface had cracked into delicate lines like dry riverbeds across the desert floor. Above them, stacked neatly along the upper shelf, were several long cardboard tubes sealed with faded brown tape. Caleb reached out and brushed the dust from the top of the crate with the back of his hand. The wood beneath was solid and heavy, not the cheap kind used for shipping ordinary household goods. Someone had chosen this container carefully. Scout sniffed along the edge of the crate and then looked up at Caleb with steady amber eyes. The dog gave a single quiet tap of his paw against the floor as though confirming that this was the place he had sensed from the moment the locker door first opened. Caleb smiled faintly. He had learned long ago that when Scout gave that signal, it meant one simple thing. Pay attention. Caleb lifted the leather portfolio first. The hinge of the cover creaked softly as he opened it, revealing a bundle of yellowed documents tied neatly together with a narrow ribbon that had once been blue. The paper felt delicate beneath his fingers, but the ink across the pages remained clear enough to read. Several sheets appeared to be property records stamped with official seals from the early 1970s. Others looked like carefully drawn maps, each one marked with precise measurements and handwritten notes in dark fountain pen ink. Caleb studied one page for a moment, noticing the name signed across the bottom in looping script. The surname seemed familiar, though he could not immediately place where he had heard it before. Scout shifted his attention back to the wooden crate, sniffing along the brass latch until he nudged it gently with his nose. The latch gave a small metallic click that echoed softly inside the hidden compartment. Caleb set the papers aside and leaned closer to the crate. The brass had not rusted completely, which meant the seal had likely been tight enough to keep moisture out over the years. He released the second latch and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, carefully arranged in rows lined with dark velvet cloth, were several small rectangular boxes made of polished walnut wood. Each one was about the size of a paperback novel and sealed with a thin brass clasp at the front. Caleb picked up the first box and opened it carefully. A warm reflection of light shimmered across the interior as the lid rose. Inside rested a collection of old gold coins nestled in individual velvet grooves, their surfaces stamped with dates that stretched back more than half a century. Caleb drew a slow breath, the quiet realization settling over him like the calm before sunrise. Scout watched him silently, tail moving once against the dusty floor, as if he had known all along that the forgotten locker held far more than anyone at the auction had ever imagined. Caleb Mercer remained kneeling beside the open crate for a long moment, the quiet weight of the discovery settling into the still air of the hidden compartment. The gold coins rested in their velvet grooves with a soft glow that felt strangely calm rather than overwhelming, as if they had been waiting patiently through the years for someone careful enough to find them. Scout lowered his head beside the crate and sniffed the velvet lining once more, before sitting down with the steady posture of a guard who had finished his search. Caleb reached into the walnut box and lifted one coin gently between his fingers. The metal felt heavier than it looked, cool against his skin despite the faint warmth of the morning light filtering into the locker. He tilted the coin slightly, studying the stamped date and the worn ridges along its edge. 1964. The engraving was still sharp enough to read clearly. Caleb had seen coins like this before in antique shops and small-town pawn counters during the years he spent drifting between repair jobs and roadside motels. He knew enough to understand that even a single coin of this kind could carry real value. Yet the quiet crate held dozens of them arranged in careful rows, each one placed with deliberate precision by someone who had once cared deeply about preserving them. Caleb placed the coin back into its velvet groove and closed the walnut lid slowly. The crate held 3 more identical boxes, each one sealed with the same brass clasp. He opened the second box and found another collection of coins, this time slightly larger pieces whose surfaces reflected a deeper gold tone beneath the dust of years. The third box contained several neatly wrapped paper rolls that felt firm and heavy when he lifted them. He did not open those yet. Something about the careful order of the crate made him pause. Whoever had hidden these items had not been careless. Everything inside the compartment had been arranged with quiet patience. Caleb leaned back and glanced toward the leather portfolio he had set aside earlier. Scout followed his movement with calm attention. The dog seemed unusually relaxed now, as though the sense of mystery that had drawn him toward the locker had already been resolved in his mind. Caleb opened the portfolio again and spread several of the documents across the dusty plywood shelf. One sheet appeared to be a property survey map marked with precise measurements in feet and inches along the edges. Another carried the letterhead of an old Dayton financial institution that Caleb vaguely remembered seeing in faded newspaper photographs years ago. The name written in bold script across the top read Whitaker Trust and Holdings. Beneath it, a signature repeated across several documents in flowing ink. Thomas Whitaker. Caleb studied the name again, his memory turning slowly through fragments of small-town conversations he had overheard in diners and repair garages over the years. Whitaker had once been one of the wealthiest businessmen in the region decades ago, a man whose investments stretched from manufacturing to farmland along the Ohio River Valley. Then one day, according to the stories people still repeated quietly, he had simply vanished. No clear explanation had ever been confirmed. The papers inside the portfolio included several letters written in careful handwriting. Caleb unfolded the first page and read slowly, the words describing instructions about preserving certain assets privately until the right moment arrived. The letter mentioned security, patience, and the importance of protecting what had been built through honest work. Caleb leaned back again, absorbing the strange weight of the situation forming around him. Somewhere along the years, a man who had once controlled fortunes had chosen to hide part of his legacy inside a simple storage locker filled with objects meant to look worthless. Scout shifted his paws slightly and rested his head beside Caleb's knee, watching the quiet space beyond the hidden wall with calm certainty. Caleb reached over and scratched gently behind the dog's ear. The faint sound of gravel crunching outside the unit drifted through the open locker door as another vehicle passed along the storage lot road. Life beyond the thin metal walls continued as though nothing unusual had happened that morning. Yet inside the narrow, hidden compartment, beneath layers of dust and forgotten wood, Caleb Mercer slowly realized that the small decision to raise his hand during a simple auction had quietly opened the door to a story that had been waiting in silence for more than half a century. Caleb Mercer sat quietly in the narrow, hidden compartment for several minutes, letting the silence settle around him while the early afternoon light slowly shifted across the dusty shelves. The coins, the documents, and the careful arrangement of everything inside the crate did not feel like the careless leftovers of a forgotten locker. They felt like a message placed deliberately into the future, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it piece by piece. Scout remained beside him with the steady calm that had guided them through many uncertain days together. The German shepherd watched Caleb with relaxed amber eyes, as if the discovery had confirmed something the dog had sensed from the beginning. Caleb gathered the scattered documents from the leather portfolio and studied them again, this time more slowly. Several of the pages were written in the same careful handwriting he had noticed earlier. The letters described instructions about safeguarding certain holdings while keeping them separated from the public record. One passage caught his attention immediately. It spoke about preserving the value of honest work for a future moment when the right hands would find it again. Caleb leaned back against the plywood wall and glanced toward the walnut boxes resting inside the crate. The quiet weight of responsibility began to settle into his thoughts. This discovery was not simply about coins or hidden assets. It was about understanding why someone had gone to such lengths to hide them in the first place. Scout shifted slightly and walked toward the rear of the hidden compartment where the cardboard tubes rested on the upper shelf. The dog lifted his nose and sniffed along the edge of one of the sealed cylinders before tapping the wooden shelf gently with his paw. Caleb stood and reached up to retrieve the tube. The cardboard felt sturdy despite its age, and the faded tape along it seam cracked softly as he peeled it open. Inside the tube rested a tightly rolled sheet of thick parchment paper. Caleb unrolled it carefully across the shelf. The document revealed a detailed hand-drawn map stretching nearly 3 feet across when fully opened. Fine ink lines marked roads, farmland boundaries, and several small towns scattered across the Ohio countryside. Near the lower corner of the map, a small red circle had been drawn around a section of land just outside Dayton. Caleb leaned closer, tracing the narrow lines with his finger while he studied the notes written along the margins. Coordinates, acreage measurements, and several short phrases written in the same precise handwriting that appeared in the letters. One note stood out clearly beside the red circle. It read simply that the foundation must remain quiet until someone worthy uncovered the first key. Caleb looked back toward the crate filled with gold coins and documents, and slowly understood what the note meant. The storage locker had not been the entire secret. It had only been the first piece of a much larger story. Scout gave a quiet breath and sat down beside the map as if approving the discovery. Caleb folded the parchment slowly and returned it to the cardboard tube, his thoughts moving through the possibilities that stretched far beyond the small storage lot. For years he had moved from town to town repairing engines, fixing fences, and searching for a steady place where life might finally feel stable again. Now, inside a hidden compartment built decades earlier by a man whose name still echoed faintly in local history, Caleb Mercer realized that a forgotten locker filled with junk had quietly placed a different path in front of him. Scout rested his head gently against Caleb's leg while the afternoon sun continued drifting across the open doorway of the storage unit. Somewhere beyond the rows of metal lockers the world continued its ordinary rhythm. But inside the small hidden space behind the wooden wall, Caleb understood that the quiet instincts of a loyal dog had just uncovered the first doorway to a legacy that had been waiting patiently for more than 50 years. Caleb Mercer stepped out of the hidden compartment slowly, carrying the cardboard tube and the leather portfolio in his hands while the quiet afternoon light stretched deeper across the concrete floor of the storage unit. For a moment he simply stood there beside the open locker, breathing in the faint scent of dust, wood, and cool metal that filled the air. The world outside the thin steel walls continued moving at its ordinary pace. Somewhere beyond the storage yard a truck engine rumbled along the road, and a distant train horn echoed across the Ohio fields. Yet inside the locker everything felt strangely suspended, as though time itself had paused to let the discovery settle into place. Scout walked out beside him and sat just inside the doorway, his gaze scanning the gravel lot with the calm awareness of a partner who had spent years watching quiet spaces for the smallest change. Caleb leaned against the metal frame of the locker and looked down at the folded map again. The red circle marking the piece of land outside Dayton seemed almost simple at first glance, yet the notes written beside it suggested something far more deliberate than an ordinary property line. Coordinates were written carefully in degrees and minutes, along with measurements describing fence posts, creek bends, and the outline of a narrow ridge running through the center of the land. Whoever had drawn the map had intended for someone to follow it precisely. Caleb folded the parchment again and slipped it back into the tube before returning his attention to the walnut boxes resting inside the crate. He carried one of them out into the light and opened it slowly. The coins gleamed softly as the sunlight touched their surfaces, each one stamped with dates stretching across different decades. Some were marked 1947, others 1964, and several bore the delicate eagle crest that collectors valued for its rarity. Caleb closed the lid carefully and set the box beside the others. The discovery was not simply valuable. It was organized. Someone had prepared it with intention. He gathered the documents from the portfolio again and read one of the letters more closely. The handwriting spoke about patience, about protecting the work of a lifetime from being lost to the shifting fortunes of the world. It described a belief that true value should remain hidden until someone willing to understand its meaning uncovered the first piece. Caleb felt a quiet smile form as he reached down to scratch behind Scout's ear. The dog leaned slightly into the gesture, his tail brushing softly against the dusty concrete floor. "You knew something was here, did you not?" Caleb said softly. Scout responded with a gentle breath and looked toward the open sky beyond the storage yard fence. Caleb gathered the walnut boxes and placed them back into the crate before sliding the crate out of the hidden compartment. The weight was substantial but manageable, perhaps 30 or 40 pounds in total. He carried it carefully to the back of his old pickup truck parked along the gravel lane. The truck had seen better years, its faded paint and worn tires telling the story of long roads and modest repair jobs scattered across several states. Yet it had carried Caleb and Scout faithfully through every uncertain mile. He placed the crate gently behind the passenger seat and returned once more to the locker to retrieve the remaining documents and the cardboard tube containing the map. Scout hopped into the truck bed with easy confidence and settled down beside the crate as though guarding it. Caleb closed the metal locker door halfway and paused for a final look at the quiet space where the hidden wall still stood open. A few hours earlier the locker had been nothing more than a forgotten unit, filled with broken furniture and dusty boxes. Now it had become the starting point of something far greater than a simple auction purchase. Caleb slid into the driver's seat and rested his hands on the steering wheel while he looked out across the rows of storage buildings stretching toward the horizon. The red circle on the map pointed toward farmland only a few miles away, land that had remained quiet and unnoticed for decades. Scout shifted slightly behind him and gave one soft bark that echoed through the cab like a quiet reminder. Caleb turned the key and the old engine rumbled awake, carrying with it the steady promise of the road ahead. Somewhere beyond the fields outside Dayton, a second secret waited patiently beneath open sky, and Caleb Mercer understood that the small decision to trust a loyal dog's instinct had just begun a journey that neither of them had expected. The old pickup rolled slowly along a narrow county road as the late afternoon sun drifted lower over the Ohio farmland. Golden lights stretched across miles of open fields where rows of corn had long since been harvested, leaving only pale stalks and wide patches of earth resting quietly beneath the autumn sky. Caleb Mercer drove with one hand steady on the wheel while the other rested near the folded map lying on the passenger seat. Scout sat upright beside him, watching the road ahead through the windshield with the calm focus that had guided them through many uncertain miles before. The coordinates from the map had led them out of Dayton and into the quiet countryside where farms were separated by long fences and clusters of oak trees that had stood through generations of changing seasons. Caleb slowed the truck as the narrow gravel road curved between two weathered wooden fence posts. According to the notes written along the edge of the parchment, the marked property should begin just beyond a shallow creek crossing about half a mile ahead. The land around them looked ordinary at first glance, a wide stretch of gently rolling pasture bordered by trees whose leaves were beginning to turn deep shades of amber and red. Yet Caleb could not shake the feeling that the place carried the same quiet intention he had sensed inside the storage locker. Someone had chosen this location carefully many years ago. Scout shifted slightly in the seat and lifted his nose toward the open window. The breeze carried the faint scent of water and fallen leaves drifting from the woods ahead. Caleb eased the truck to a stop near the edge of the creek where a narrow wooden bridge crossed the shallow stream. The boards creaked softly beneath the truck's tires as he guided the vehicle across. On the other side the road continued only a short distance before fading into a grassy path leading toward a stand of tall sycamore trees. Caleb parked beneath the shade of one of the trees and stepped out onto the quiet ground. The air felt cooler here, touched by the steady flow of the creek nearby. Scout jumped down beside him and stretched briefly before beginning to explore the clearing with careful steps. Caleb unfolded the parchment map once again and studied the markings. The red circle covered roughly 10 acres of land stretching from the creek bank toward a low ridge rising gently beyond the trees. Several small symbols had been drawn along the ridge line, including a square shape that appeared to mark some kind of structure. Caleb walked slowly toward the ridge while Scout moved ahead through the tall grass. The land sloped upward gradually, and as they reached the top Caleb noticed something unusual near the center of the clearing. A patch of ground about 6 feet across had been covered with flat stones arranged in a neat circular pattern. Moss had grown along the edges of the stones, and fallen leaves had gathered across their surface, but the shape remained clearly visible even after all these years. Scout approached the circle and sniffed along the stones before tapping one gently with his paw. The stone shifted slightly, revealing that it had been placed there rather than formed naturally in the soil. Caleb crouched beside the circle and brushed away the layer of leaves. Beneath them the stones formed a carefully fitted cover, almost like a lid protecting something beneath the ground. Caleb studied the map again, and then glanced toward the crate resting safely in the truck behind them. The notes from Thomas Whitaker had mentioned a foundation that must remain quiet until the first key was discovered. Caleb understood now that the coins and documents inside the storage locker had only been part of that key. Scout sat down beside the circle of stones and looked up at Caleb with the same calm certainty that had guided him from the moment they first stepped into the storage unit that morning. Caleb ran his hand slowly across the top stone, feeling the cool texture beneath his palm while the breeze moved gently through the sycamore branches overhead. Somewhere beneath the carefully placed stones, another secret waited patiently in the quiet earth, a second chapter of a story that had been hidden for more than 50 years. Caleb took a steady breath and began lifting the first stone from the circle, knowing that whatever lay beneath the ridge would reveal why a man like Thomas Whitaker had trusted time itself to guard the rest of his legacy. The first stone came loose with a quiet scrape as Caleb Mercer lifted it from the circle and set it carefully beside the others. Beneath it lay a compact layer of soil that looked slightly darker than the surrounding ground, as if it had once been disturbed and then patiently returned to rest. Scout stepped closer and lowered his nose to the exposed patch of earth, inhaling slowly while his ears tilted forward in quiet concentration. The German shepherd did not bark or growl. Instead, he circled the stone ring once, then returned to the center and sat down again with the calm certainty that had guided them through every discovery that day. Caleb removed 2 more stones from the circle and brushed away the loose dirt beneath them with his hands. A dull metallic surface appeared beneath the soil after only a few inches of digging. He cleared the remaining dirt until the outline of a rectangular metal lid emerged from the earth. The surface was weathered but still solid, with a narrow iron handle set into its center. Caleb leaned back slightly, studying the structure beneath the ridge. The lid looked like the entrance to a buried vault no more than 4 feet long and perhaps 3 feet wide. Whoever had built it had chosen durable materials meant to last through decades of changing weather. Caleb grasped the iron handle and pulled gently. At first the lid did not move. The soil around its edges had hardened over the years, holding it in place like a quiet seal. Caleb loosened the surrounding dirt with a small folding shovel from the truck before trying again. This time the lid lifted slowly with a soft creak that echoed faintly beneath the open sky. A cool breath of air rose from the chamber below, carrying the dry scent of sealed metal and aged wood. Caleb held the lid open and peered inside. The underground compartment was lined with thick steel panels, forming a narrow vault about 3 feet deep. Inside rested 2 long wooden chests positioned side by side on a reinforced metal base. The chests were built from dark oak boards and secured with heavy brass hinges that had aged to a muted green tone. Scout stepped forward and looked down into the chamber beside Caleb, his tail moving slowly against the grass as though the discovery had simply confirmed what he had sensed all along. Caleb climbed down carefully into the shallow vault and lifted the lid of the first oak chest. The hinges opened with a slow, steady motion, revealing rows of neatly arranged envelopes sealed in wax and stacked in careful bundles. Each envelope bore the same elegant handwriting Caleb had seen in the documents from the locker. He opened one gently and unfolded the letter inside. The page described a network of investments placed quietly into trusts, farmland, and small manufacturing partnerships across several counties in Ohio and Indiana. Another envelope contained legal documents transferring ownership of multiple parcels of land that had remained untouched for generations. Caleb set the papers aside and opened the second chest. Inside were several velvet-lined trays holding additional gold coins along with a collection of antique silver certificates and carefully preserved bonds issued by banks that had long since changed names or merged with larger institutions. The quiet realization settled into Caleb's thoughts with a calm clarity. Thomas Whitaker had not hidden his legacy in fear or secrecy alone. He had preserved it as a living foundation meant to support something greater in the future. Caleb climbed out of the vault and stood beside the open circle of stones while the afternoon sun dipped lower over the fields. The land around them stretched wide and peaceful beneath the changing colors of autumn. Scout walked a few steps along the ridge and looked back toward Caleb as though waiting for him to understand the final piece of the story. Caleb returned to the truck and retrieved the leather portfolio from the seat. As he turned one final page, he noticed a letter folded separately from the others. The handwriting was the same steady script he had seen throughout the documents. The message was simple and clear. It explained that the man who uncovered the hidden foundation must use it not for personal wealth alone, but to rebuild opportunity for the community that had once supported Whitaker's early life. Caleb looked across the quiet farmland again and then down at Scout, who wagged his tail gently in the fading sunlight. The loyal dog had followed a scent that led far beyond a forgotten storage locker filled with junk. And now, standing above a legacy preserved for more than half a century, Caleb Mercer understood that the greatest discovery waiting beneath the ridge was not only the wealth itself, but the responsibility that came with it. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western tree line when Caleb Mercer finished closing the heavy lid of the underground vault. The cool metal settled back into place with a quiet certainty, sealing the chamber once more beneath the ridge where it had rested unseen for more than half a century. Caleb replaced the flat stones one by one, fitting them carefully into the circle just as they had been arranged before. Fallen leaves drifted gently across the ground as the evening breeze moved through the tall sycamore branches overhead. Scout sat nearby watching the quiet work with patient amber eyes, his tail brushing softly through the grass as though the long day had unfolded exactly as he had expected. When the final stone was set back into place, the circle once again looked like nothing more than an ordinary patch of weathered ground hidden among the rolling farmland. Caleb stepped back and studied the ridge for a moment, committing the location to memory. The map, the documents, and the vault beneath the earth had revealed far more than a forgotten fortune. They had uncovered the final request of a man who had once believed deeply in the quiet strength of community. Caleb walked slowly back toward the truck parked beneath the sycamore trees where the evening light now painted the fields in warm shades of gold and copper. Scout followed at his side, moving with the relaxed confidence of a companion who had guided them through the first chapter of something far greater than either of them had expected. Caleb opened the driver door and placed the leather portfolio carefully on the passenger seat before sitting down behind the wheel. For a moment, he did not start the engine. Instead, he looked out across the wide stretch of farmland that lay peaceful beneath the fading sky. The quiet land carried a kind of still wisdom, the sort that grows slowly through years of patient seasons and steady work. Caleb unfolded the final letter from Thomas Whitaker once more and read the closing lines again. The words spoke about building something lasting not through wealth alone, but through opportunity given freely to those willing to work with integrity and care. Caleb thought about the small towns scattered across the region, the empty storefronts he had passed on quiet streets, and the farmers who still worked long days hoping the next harvest might be kinder than the last. The legacy hidden beneath the ridge was not simply a treasure waiting to be claimed. It was a foundation waiting to be used for something meaningful. Scout rested his head gently against Caleb's arm, as if sensing the weight of the decision forming in his mind. Caleb reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear with a faint smile. "You always did have a good nose for the right direction," he said quietly. Scout gave a soft breath and wagged his tail once against the worn truck seat. Caleb started the engine and turned the truck slowly back toward the narrow road leading away from the ridge. The sky above the Ohio countryside had begun to glow with the soft colors of sunset, long streaks of orange and violet stretching across the horizon. As the truck rolled across the wooden bridge and back toward the quiet county road, Caleb felt something he had not felt in many years. It was not the excitement of sudden fortune or the relief of easy answers. It was something steadier than that. It was purpose. Over the weeks that followed, Caleb would return to the ridge many times, working patiently through the documents and legal records that connected the hidden assets to the communities they had once supported. The investments and land holdings would gradually be organized into a trust designed to restore small businesses, farms, and local workshops that had struggled through decades of economic change. Caleb did not rush the process. Like the man who had hidden the legacy in the first place, he believed that meaningful work required patience. And through every step of that quiet journey, Scout remained beside him, the same loyal companion who had first paused in front of a forgotten storage locker filled with junk and sensed that something important was waiting behind the dust and broken furniture. Years later, People in several small towns across the Ohio countryside would speak quietly about the man and the German shepherd who had helped bring new life to old places that had nearly been forgotten. They would never know the full story of the stones beneath the ridge or the vault hidden quietly below the earth. But Caleb Mercer understood something simple each time he looked out across those open fields at sunset. Sometimes the world hides its greatest opportunities in places that appear worthless at first glance, waiting patiently for someone kind enough to follow a loyal dog and listen when instinct whispers that there is more to the story than anyone else can see.